9,994, 9,996, 7, 8, 9, 10,000. Welcome to Off the Rails. Hello, my name is Rob Scargill. I'm the lead curator of Railway Futures, the Portsmouth Gallery at the National Railway Museum in York, and I'm also a recently retired Sunday League left winger with a dodgy knee. I'm very excited because we're here today at Broadhurst Park, the home of FC United of Manchester, to talk about the world's most popular pastime, football. Now, there's so many ways that we could have gone with this video today. We could have talked about the role of rail in the popularisation of the sport in the late 19th century. We could have talked about special fan services like the short-lived 1970s League Line and Disco Train. Or we could even have talked about the indirect but essential role that the railways played in the dark rise of football hooliganism.
There are many in our midst who certainly don't regard property or their fellow men with respect. The coaches were systematically ripped apart by the trainload of hooligans who had been to see Tottenham Hotspur play Derby.
But instead, what we're going to do is focus on the formation of two football clubs. Both of these clubs have had a momentous impact on the world of football. Both of them are from the northwest of England, and both of them were formed at railway factories. We start then, as I'm sure many of you will have already guessed, with Newton Heath LYR FC, later renamed Manchester United. Now, it's quite well known that Man United were originally made up of railway workers, though I'm sure that will be new information to a lot of you watching this video. But not much more is known typically beyond that headline. So to start with the basics then, Newton Heath LYR FC, what does the LYR stand for? It stands for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, which was a railway company incorporated in 1847 at the height of what we call railway mania, which is when railways were being built en masse in Victorian Britain and connecting the country like never before. The railway expanded rapidly, and at its greatest extent, it went as far west as Blackpool, Fleetwood and Liverpool, and as far east as Hull, with a whole host of major industrial towns and cities in between. The railway was massive. It was the third largest in northern England, and it needed lots of rolling stock with which to operate. So it needed locomotives to haul the trains, it needed wagons for freight, and it needed carriages as well to carry the passengers. And this is where Newton Heath comes in. So Newton Heath is this small area just outside of city centre Manchester, about 3 miles east. And that is where it was selected that a dedicated carriage and wagon works would be built in 1876, following a fire at the crowded nearby factory, the previous factory at Miles Platting. And just to give a bit of context as to what the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway was like in 1876, we have a quote here from Ernest Leopold Ahrens, a famous railway historian from the period. Now, he states that the railway was a railway of ugly, inconvenient stations, of broken down engines and dirty carriages, and of a superlative unpunctuality to which no pen could do justice. Basically, football, meanwhile, was growing in popularity with the working classes as a result of rapid industrialisation. You've got to remember that in this period, towns and cities across Britain are growing exponentially because of the employment opportunities that are on offer. And football clubs are sprouting up everywhere because companies saw that there was potential and there was real positivity to having sport with their workers, because it encouraged them to work together, it encouraged them to keep fit, and it encouraged them as well to stay disciplined. And Newton Heath was no different. There were lots of factories obviously up north. Newton Heath was very similar to a lot of railway factories at that time, and they formed their own football club in 1878. I hope it doesn't disappoint too much, but not much is known about that original Newton Heath team. No player details survive, for example. And in fact, the only reason that we know that they were established in 1878 is because of a fixture list that survives from 4 years later, which states so. And there's something else as well that's very important on that fixture list, and that's a name. So the club's first president, Attock. Now, this guy is really, really important because he is the founder of what then became Manchester United. Frederick Attock came from a family of railway engineers. He served an apprenticeship under his father George, who was the superintendent of the carriage and wagon department of a different railway, the Great Eastern Railway. And Frederick was appointed in 1877 at the age of 30 as the superintendent of Newton Heath Carriage Works. And we can see in front of me here, we've got these drawings that were all from the period in which he was boss, basically, he was under control. So we have, for example, a plan of a composite carriage for different classes of passengers. We've got a third class saloon, a first class picnic saloon as well. That's really fun. We've got a brake van here as well. Just under here as well, we've got a boiler wagon, and then we've also got a horse box. Attock is seen as one of the most important and influential figures in the whole of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway's history. And if we take a closer look at these drawings, we can see why. So if we take, for example, this plan of the composite carriage, we can see a signature here. This is Frederick Attock's signature. We can also see it here, and we see it here, and we see it there as well. We see it on every single one of these drawings, and that's because as superintendent, he was responsible for all these designs, and he had an enormous influence on the way that the railway operates. He influenced so many developments in carriage and wagon design during his time with the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, especially when it came to passenger comfort. The company's board was so reluctant actually to spend money on passenger comfort that in a busy period in 1860, they actually suggested that they could just use cattle wagons and add portable roofs and seats to them, and that would suffice. But Attock pushed for higher standards, and he had no less than 10 patents to his name, including a mixed headrest and armrest design, and also sliding windows. And as well as that, things like exterior components, like improvements to brakes and axles. In 1882, he convinced the directors to put lights in all the third-class compartments for the carriages. Before that, passengers would literally travel all night in the dark. As president of the Works Football Club, it was Attock and his team that were responsible for finding Newton Heath LYR FC a pitch, which they did, North Road. They rented it from the church authorities of Manchester, and it was stony in summer and boggy in winter. It was basically a Sunday league pitch. The team were quite good, better than most actually at their level, and one of the reasons for this is because Frederick Attock would offer employment opportunities for exceptional footballers, something that other clubs that were tied to industry obviously couldn't do. But we do know that the first recorded result was in November 1880. Now I'm really sorry to say to all the Man United fans out there, but you lost 6-0 to Bolton Wanderers reserves, and it'll forever go down in history, unfortunately, that is the first scoreline that was ever on record. And I'd just like to say very professionally and respectfully that I took no joy in hearing that as a Leeds United fan. Other than their name, one of the only other things that's really well known about Newton Heath LYR FC is that they wore a green and gold kit. And this was really emphasised in the 1992-93 Premier League season, the inaugural Premier League season, which Man United would go on to win. And that's because the club launched a now iconic third kit that featured green and gold halves with black cord. And for the promotional kind of photo shoot for this, they did something brilliant. They made the players look like they were from 100 years ago, where you've got iconic players like Eric Cantona or Mark Hughes with fake moustaches and Brill cream. Even Sir Alex Ferguson joined in, and it looks absolutely fantastic. But there's a myth, it would seem, that's kind of surrounding these colours, and that's that Newton Heath only definitely wore that green gold colourway between 1893 and 1896. We actually have it on record that the first time any kind of kit is mentioned of Newton Heath, they wore white shirts with a blue cord. The second time that any mention of a kit is the Manchester and District FA yearbook. And in that, it states 8 years later that they wore red and white halves. Now, this makes total sense, right? Because they were associated with the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. And what's the most obvious iconography of that? Well, it's the two counties' roses. So the first mention that you actually have of green and gold is in newspaper cuttings from the 1893-94 season. But as I say, this is quickly dropped by the 1896-97 season, which is when they wore white again. The reason for the green and gold is often attributed to the railways. I thought what I'd do is I'd do a little bit of digging and see as to why that may be, what that railway link actually is. And the best guess that I can come up with is that it's got something to do with the locomotive liveries from the time that the club was established in 1878. So the liveries at this period were green with copper and brass parts, so you've got that green and gold. But the green wasn't unique to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. In fact, most railway companies in the mid-Victorian period will have at some point painted their locomotives green, the reason being that it used an easy-to-acquire paint that had vegetable pigment in it. And also as well, it's not like the most iconic Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway livery was that colour. That's definitely black with red and white stripes. And also, by 1893, when the club actually wore green and gold, Newton Heath had actually dropped the LYR from their name. They got promoted to the First Division for the first time in 1892, and then they became a limited company in their own right and severed ties with the railway. And this doesn't sound like it was that great a relationship with the railway, because they then overcharged them for the use of the North Road pitch. But unfortunately, the club was hamstrung because the church authorities deemed it unfair and unethical to charge fans to enter. So Newton Heath decided, well, if we can't pay for if we can't get the revenue that we need to pay for the pitch, we'll have to move. So they moved to a place called Clayton and to a ground called Bank Street before moving eventually in 1910 to the now iconic stadium, Old Trafford. To complete the story, Attock suffered with poor health and was forced to retire, issuing his resignation in 1895. He was clearly well liked by his colleagues and also by his workmen as well. Minute meetings show a really kind, caring man. He was given, on his retirement, quite a few gifts. He was given 6 candlesticks, he was given a golden watch, and he was given £500, which is the equivalent of £50,000 today. We also think that he may have been given this, either that or he made this himself. But we can see here, this is a beautifully made photographic album from 1895. So you can see the date there on top, and you can also see Frederick Attock's name here as well. So you can see this is a photographic album of all the officials of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. And if I flick right through, we've got him right here. So this is Frederick Attock, and you can see, obviously he's got his portrait there, but it's also got his signature. The same signatures that is used over and over again in every single one of these drawings. Today, at a time of hyper-commercialism in football and the growing feeling among some supporters that the game is losing what made it so good in the first place, the green and gold of Newton Heath has acted as a tool of defiance for fans against current club ownership models and perceived mismanagement. We're here today at Broadhurst Park, the home of FC United of Manchester, who were formed in 2005 by disillusioned Man United fans. It's based in Moston, only a stone's throw from the original Newton Heath Carriage works, and we're very fortunate today to be speaking with Paul Hurst, one of the club founders and also current member of the board, and also Elsie Baxter, who is the manager of the women's first team. First of all, where are we? What is FC United of Manchester?
So we are in Moston in North Manchester, and we're a 100% supporter-owned club, operating men's first team, a women's first team. We've got youth teams. Kind of a one-stop shop for football in North Manchester.
Built this stadium, 10 years ago. Best stadium, I think, around that's sort of for this level of football, particularly as well for us in women's football. Like, we don't get to play in stadiums like this when we go away.
It's very symbolic for us to be playing around here. Obviously, the history of Manchester United, which this club is born out of. We're 15 minutes up the road from the original Newton Heath Carriage works, where Newton Heath LYR was formed. 15 minutes up the other road from North Road, Manchester United's first ever ground. So feel really rooted in, as a sense of place in this community. But, you're talking, nearly 150 years on there. It's a different community now, and we want to be here and being part of that community.
Different community, but we still see those gold and green scarves flying about, don't we? So yeah, different community, but the same feel.
And what about the club's railway routes? I know that some of the stadium's infrastructure was inspired by the railways in some way.
If you look at the outside of the stadium, some of the wooden cladded outside is inspired by railway sleepers. So is kind of a part of the design of the ground. When we built the ground, we didn't want it to be kind of like an identikit, cookie cutter ground. We wanted it to have a little bit of character and mean something and be, kind of, don't want to be too grand, but iconic within the community and something that people can look at there. So obviously, with the history of the club and Manchester United in the local area, we wanted to have something, something relating to that. So yeah, if you look at the outside, you can see that kind of railway sleeper influence. It's a really fascinating story about the link between football and the railways. If you've got the Newton Heath one there, but even from an FC United point of view, our first ever friendly 20 years ago was against the RMI, the Railway Mechanics Institute there. I think they're sadly have gone as a club since then, but it was probably, coming on 120 odd years later, it was probably full circle thing that was our first ever game as a club there, being against another club who's got that, have got that history, and we've seen that probably throughout playing there. Like Harrogate Railway, we've played over the years. So
I only took over as manager this year, and one of my big things was about trying to create like this sort of family sense within the team. I don't think we've had that for a few years now. To me, I've been an FC United fan since it began. I've been coming for 20 years now. My dad used to bring me when I was a kid. He brought me and my brother when we were really little. I'm only 28, so like from sort of 7-8-year-old, I've been coming to FC United. So the club means a lot to me because it's sort of what I grew up with. We started as Man United fans, and then we got rid of our season tickets, and we just started coming here, and we came here every single weekend. Well, not necessarily here, but this was only built 10 years ago, but we started coming to FC 20 years ago, and then obviously when this was built, we've been coming here, and me and my dad now still come to the men's games every weekend. And then now obviously at the women's games as well every weekend. So yeah, this club means everything to me.
We move on then to the second of our Railway Factory football clubs. This time we're going 30 miles northwest of here to Preston, which is where the Dick Kerr Ladies were formed. This is one of football's greatest ever stories of talent, courage, kindness and defiance, and much of it could have easily been lost were it not for the work of former footballer, author and historian Gail Newsham. Having read her book, In a League of Their Own, I was blown away not only by the Dick Kerr Ladies themselves, but by the incredible impact her publication has had beyond this. Much of the information we include in this part of the video is taken from there, and if you're interested in finding out more, I greatly recommend it. Before we get on to the club itself, we've got to look at the company in which they were formed, Dick Kerr & Co. The company existed in some form or another between 1853 and 1919, and the period of history that we're really interested in follows on pretty much exactly from the time Newton Heath changed the name to Manchester United in 1902. And it's because in August that year, Dick Kerr & Co. ended up taking over Strand Road Works in Preston, which is where the Dick Kerr Ladies would eventually fall. It was also in this year that the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, yes, the very same one, decided that the Liverpool to Southport line was at capacity, and what they needed to do to increase traffic was to electrify. Dick Kerr & Co. got the contract, and they took care of absolutely everything, electrifying 23 miles of the route using electric multiple units and third rail. I say they took care of absolutely everything. There was one thing that they didn't do, and that was the building of the car bodies, which was actually manufactured right here again at Newton Heath Carriage Works. This was the first time that any section of mainline railway had been converted to electric traction, and what I love about this is how progressive this is. That was over 120 years ago, and still today we need an extensive electrification programme if we are to meet our environmental, economic and social transport objectives. Now we're back in the museum drawing store because I wanted to show you a few drawings from that period of early electrification. Here, for example, we've got those Newton Heath electric cars. We've got a first-class electric trailer car here, and also a powered third-class electric motor car here from 1904, from that Liverpool to Southport line. And I think what these drawings really show is that kind of advancement from the late 19th to the early 20th century, that advancement in passenger comfort. For example, you can see the seats that are here, you know, they look really beautiful, sort of lots of detail on the drawing. And you've also got the word mahogany written so many times. We've also got these Dick Kerr blueprints here, and if I roll these out, you can see. Following the successful conversion of the Liverpool Southport line, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway really wanted to expand on their electrification, this time in the Manchester area. In this period, in 1912, Dick Kerr ended up experimenting with a short branch line between Bury and Holcombe Brook, where they tried this high voltage DC overhead system. This was really experimental, and they ended up making it a real success. So electric trains went into public service in July 1913 using 3600 volts DC, and this was the first ever high voltage DC installation in the world. But this drawing isn't from that project. This drawing is from a later project that came off the back of it. So following that, following Holcombe Brook, what the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway decided to do was to electrify between Manchester, Victoria and Bury. But you can see here from the drawing, if I just show you, so this is the cable arrangements for the coaches, because the coaches were built again at Newton Heath and the electrics were supplied by Dick Kerr, that you've actually got shoes here, so those metal blocks that pick up the electrics. And that shows that they didn't stick with that overhead system, but instead they reverted back to third rail. This drawing is dated from 1914, which is the same year that the First World War broke out in continental Europe. And this is really where the Dick Kerr Ladies story comes in. Because, you've got the men from the factory going away to fight, a lot of them anyway, and then you've got the women coming in to fill their places. And Britain didn't really need, tram cars or electric railways anywhere near as much as it needed armament in this period. Britain was not prepared at all for war in continental Europe on this scale. A bill was laid before the House of Commons where the government could take over any factory or any workshop and they could use that as a place to manufacture munitions, which is exactly what Dick Kerr's Preston factory ended up becoming. But they did still produce some railway work. For example, there were advanced petrol electric locomotives that were used on the Western Front, which were still produced in this factory. But for the main, the women would manufacture munitions for use in the First World War. At the Science Museum, we have this wonderful painting by Stanhope Forbes from 1918, set in a similar factory in Rotherham. And you can see from this painting the detail in it, the kind of grimy conditions that the women were working in. They were expected to handle explosive material. They were expected to work long hours. And you can really feel that coming out of this picture. And that's exactly the environment that the Dick Kerr Ladies found themselves in. Women's football clubs were forming at factories up and down the country. Dick Kerr Ladies weren't unique in that regard. And it was in October 1917 that the women were out on their tea break, and as they would do a lot, they were playing football. And one of their members, Grace Sibbett, decided to challenge the men's team to a football match on a friendly. And what they did is they had a friendly match in a local park. They arranged the date and they loved it so much that they then formed their own club. That same month, the matron of the local military hospital approached Dick Kerr & Co and asked if there was any fundraising that they could do for wounded soldiers over the Christmas period. And the Dick Kerr Ladies suggested, well, tell you what, instead of putting on a concert or something like that, we could have a football match against another munitions factory's women's team. So that's exactly what they did. And on Christmas Day, 1917, they played at Deepdale, the home of Preston North End, still the home of Preston North End, in front of 10,000 spectators. They raised £600 for charity, which is the equivalent of £50,000 in today's money. Momentum was building and games started to pile up, and by the end of the 1917-18 season, the Dick Kerr Ladies had played another 4 matches at Deepdale, again in front of thousands of fans. They were managed by draftsman Alfred Frankland, and the 2 best players of this time were probably captain Alice Kell and striker Florrie Redford. When the war ended in November 1918, charitable donations were needed more than ever, and the Dick Kerr Ladies were only too happy to help out. So on the 8th of December that year, they ended up playing the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways women's team, and then on Christmas Day, they played against Bolton Ladies in a 2-2 draw in front of 8,000 people, again raising even more money for charity. Women's football was becoming increasingly popular in this period, and teams would play further afield against each other. In April 1920, 17 players from France's Federation of Women's Sports Societies came to England, where they toured and they played different women's teams in aid of discharged and disabled soldiers. This was a brilliant diplomatic gesture after the First World War, and thousands of people actually came out to greet the French team as they arrived in Preston to play against the Dick Kerr Ladies. A full itinerary of events was planned for the players, including a tour of the Dick Kerr factory, and eventually 4 matches were played between the teams, raising a total of £3,000. And the Dick Kerr Ladies would actually go on to play even more games internationally. 7 months later, they made the opposite trip to France and played against them there, and that was a huge success. And then they would even play in America and in Canada, and they would often represent England as well as one of the best teams in the nation. Undoubtedly the most famous player in the club's history signed for Dick Kerr around this time. Teenager Lily Parr came on the recommendation of another player, speedy midfielder Alice Woods, and manager Alfred Frankland sealed the deal by offering her a job. And this was something very similar to what Frederick Attock used to do at Newton Heath, where he couldn't offer to pay the players, but what he could do is offer to give them employment opportunities. And this turned out to be an exceptional decision. Parr played at left back in her first season, but was quickly moved to a more attacking role on the left wing a year later. In a 30-year career for the club, she scored 986 goals. Just to put that into perspective, Wayne Rooney scored 366 for club and country in his time as a professional, he'd have had to play at the same standard into his 70s to match Lily Parr. Women's football matches were getting increasingly popular, especially at Dick Kerr, who seemed to be winning every single game that they played. I've actually got the results from the back end of the year 1920, and they read brilliantly. They read like a cricket score. So here we go. You've got 3-0, 6-1, 6-0, 7-0, 9-1, 7-0, 9-0, a 1-1 terrible draw, 2-0, 6-0, 2-0, 4-0, 12-0, 4-0, 7-0, 4-0. I would kill for that at Leeds United. On the 17th of December, they became the first women's team to play at night when they borrowed 2 anti-aircraft searchlights to illuminate the pitch. And again, this was played in front of thousands of people for charity. Then a week later, on Boxing Day 1920, the Dick Kerr Ladies played possibly their most significant match in their history, when 53,000 spectators turned up to watch them play St Helens at Goodison Park, Everton Stadium in Liverpool. 10,000 people were actually turned away at the turnstiles, and they raised over £3,000 for charity that day, which is the equivalent of over 120 grand. Now, just to put that again into context with the men's game, since the Football League was inaugurated in 1888, attendance had never been that high before. Yes, there were FA Cup finals that had higher attendances, but never in a league match had they ever got 53,000. So an absolutely incredible feat for the women's game. And so with great success came fear and misogyny. In 1921, the Dick Kerr Ladies played an amazing 67 games, still while working full-time at the factory, in front of over 900,000 spectators in total. What an incredible figure. But it was on the 5th of December that year that the FA decided they were going to ban women's football altogether, citing the reason, their strong opinion that the game of football is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged. And just like that, the game changed forever. Dick Kerr persisted, but unable to play at FA-affiliated clubs' grounds. What they ended up seeing is attendances dwindle and women's football clubs all around them drop like flies, unfortunately. They persisted. They carried on until 1965, eventually folding after 48 years. And I just want to end with their incredible record. They had played 755 games, won 682 of those, drew 39 and lost only 34. After the First World War, many of the women who were working at Dick Kerr & Co. were released from the factory. Obviously, munitions were no longer needed, and the men as well that were returning from the war returned to their jobs that they'd originally had. Details surrounding players' employment are unfortunately vague, but we do know that Alfred Franklin managed to get at least one of the women a job back in the Dick Kerr offices, and we believe that he might have done that with a number of other players. What we definitely know is he had great links with the local psychiatric hospital, and he managed to get a lot of the women players jobs there as well, so they ended up working there for years to come. For the men, they came back to the Dick Kerr factory, and within a year, the company was acquired by English Electric Company. And for those that know the railway history, and I know there's a lot of you out there that do, you will know the incredible impact that they had on Britain's railways. For example, in our own collection, we have the Deltic prototype, which was built in 1955 in the very same factory in Preston. Well, is there anything that we can take from the Dick Kerr Ladies story?
So I know a lot about the Dick Kerr Ladies story, actually. My mum bought me a book about 10 years ago or something, and it's called A League of Their Own. And I read that book when I was younger, and I just was sort of inspired by it. And I just thought it was a fantastic story, and it showed what women's football could be. Because it was huge, like bringing in crowds of 50,000 people. And I think that looking at that story, that's what we need to try and create again. And if we can sort of move in that direction and get people to fall in love with women's football and realise how good it actually is to watch. But if we can make that story like a more well-known thing in women's football, like it can inspire people and we can create that again.
I think that, the growth is amazing, and I think the recognition they're seeing there. I said the men's team recently played at Lancaster City, and they've got a plaque on their clubhouse now commemorating Jenny Harris, who played for both Dick Kerr Ladies and Lancaster Ladies there. So I think, you know, clubs are recognising that, you know, it's a rich part of football's history there, and it's really important that we recognise that and people know more about that story.
Clubs now want the women to play on their pitches. They don't want to charge them for it. In general, especially here, but I think in general, women are starting to feel more part of it. And I think with that as well, things are only going to get bigger from here on out. More money's going to be pumped in, more attitudes are going to change. And I think I can only see women's football growing and growing from here. People think it's just a game, but it's more than that. It's life or death. I think here we can try and create that sort of bringing women's football back to where it should be, because football is life or death in the Northwest. So it can only get bigger, can't it? Women's football here. This is the place for it.
Rail transformed the way people travelled in the mid-19th century, and by 1900 it was one of the largest employers in the country, the NHS of its day. So it should be no surprise then that it has had such an enduring influence on popular culture and things that we take for granted today, from, you know, the way that we speak, the books we read, the music that we listen to, even the football teams that we support. These two stories of Newton Heath and of Dick Kerr show the amazing communities and cultures that can be fostered by the railways and have been fostered over the last 2 centuries. But what they also show is what happens when bigoted ideas win. And we can only think, you know, what would have happened to women's football were it not for the FA ban in 1921. You've got Manchester United, who are one of the biggest clubs in the world, and you've got the Dick Kerr Ladies, who have faded into obscurity. Today, only 1 in 5 of the nation's railway workforce are women, and while great strides have been made, there's still plenty more that can be done. Network Rail and organisations like that are doing amazing work where they're going into schools and colleges and encouraging women and girls to get into engineering. And also support organisations like Women in Rail are giving networking opportunities and other employment opportunities as well. By establishing a more equal rail industry, we can benefit all members of society. Thanks very much for watching this video. If I hit the crossbar, you have to like and subscribe. That's first time as well, get it?